July 10th, 1973 was very worthy of being celebrated in the history of the Bahamas, this was not always the case.
The Bremen Road riot started in 1942 by a group of young black Bahamian men, with most of them being from the Family Islands. They were upset because of the low wages. According to Gail Sanders in her book, Bahamian Society After Emancipation, it has for the most part been described simply as a wage dispute. However, the late political activist Dame Doris Johnson and former Labour leader Sir Randall Fox both attribute deeper significance to the riot. They recognize it as the beginning of a political movement when the blacks demanded for social and political change. Whites were given the most jobs and they were receiving a higher income than the blacks. This resulted in a very high percentage in unemployment. It was a short, spontaneous outburst by a group of laborers and occurred against a background of narrow socio-economic and political policies. According to Nora Martin and Virgil Henry Starr in their book Bay Street and the 1942 Riot, the riot was an important event in the country's history. It spoke to the growing dissatisfaction of the Bahamas. Black majority with the system of apartheid that harmed them in politically, economically, and socially. It signaled the beginning of the end of second-class citizenship for blacks in the Bahamas. This is where a group of angry young men assembled on Oaks Field, where the old airport was, and formed a mob. They gathered clubs and sticks and began to march down towards Bay Street, singing songs such as "We'll Never Let the Old Flag Fall." Napoleon McPhee, one of the rioters, insisted that they sing "Burma Road, Declare War" on the Conky Joe. They went straight to the Colonial Secretary's office, where they addressed Attorney General Eric Hollinan about the matter. He tried to calm the workers down, but was unable to do so. The mob was trying to negotiate their wages, but was unsuccessful. After being outside of the assemblage so long, the mob got frustrated about what was being said to them. They headed down Bay Street, smashing anything, including bars owned by the Bay Street merchants, while the police force tried to take action by driving them into Grantstown. The rioters became more out of control. There were bottles and stones thrown at the police. Also, according to Gail Sanders, shots were fired and one man, Roy Johnson, was killed. Another, David Smith, was wounded and died later that day in the hospital. The mob not only attacked properties and stores of the whites, but also light-skinned blacks as well, who had to run and take cover when the mob was dashing towards them. 3 were killed in the incident and 2 died from wounds. The aftermath of the riot was that blacks stood up for themselves. Wages were increased, free lunches were given out, and unions were formed.
Really stemmed. It was a time when during the Second World War we were building the base, what is now our airport. It was a big labor injection in the country because everybody who could work was put to work to build this airport. It turned out that what was being paid as wages wasn't what the Americans were being paid. The Bahamians weren't paid the same thing, and they took umbrage at that, and they couldn't take any more of it, so they started to walk on Bay Street, and they went up to on Bay Street, and They started breaking up everything in sight, all the storefronts and we had the Riot Act, as it was called, was read, and the town was shut down. All of that took place in 1942. So between 1942 and independence, which came, 30 years later? No, independence was what? 31 years later. It's a long time. And so we shouldn't confuse the two. When that took place, the Bay Street riots and the Bay Street fire and all that, when that took place, I was a boy of 12 in Government High School. And I remember it well. I remember it very well, but I was in my second form, in Form 4, and we were sent home early that day because of what was going on Bay Street.
The year 2012 marks the 50th anniversary of the culmination of women's suffrage movement in the Bahamas. The movement took place against the dramatic backdrop of the Burma Road riot of 1942, the general strike of 1958, the labor movement of the 1950s, and the majority rule in civil rights movement. Bahamian women worked tirelessly along with men to resist and redress the racial discrimination and the political and economic inequities that permeated Bahamian society. There were essentially two branches to the suffrage movement in the Bahamas. They cross-fertilized each other and merged at pivotal times to speak with one voice. Several of the key women belonged to both arms of the movement. Mary Ingram was elected as president of the suffrage movement in 1957. Georgiana Simonet was the vice president, and Eugenia Lockhart was the treasurer. In 1958, Dr. Joris Johnson returned home from studying abroad and joined this movement. During the year 1959 and 1960, the movement gained considerable ground, advancing petitions and demonstrating publicly for the right to vote. In November 1960, Eugenia Lockhart and Dr. Joris Johnson accompanied Henry M. Taylor, chairman of the PLP, to London to present a petition to the Secretary of the State for the Colonies. In January 1961, a select committee of the House of Assembly gave a report in favor of the right to vote for women, but with the effect from January 1963. The PLP and the independents in the House of Assembly opposed the report. An appeal was made to the House of Commons in England again. Finally, on February 23, 1961, a bill to enable women to vote was enacted with effect from June 30, 1962. Finally, Bahamian women voted for the first time on November 26, 1962. May, as she was affectionately called, was born on July 30, 1901 in New Providence. A housewife, she became actively involved in politics in the late 1940s when her husband Rufus was a member of the House of Assembly for the Crooked Island Acklands District. In the 1949 general election, her husband lost his seat, and he attributed his loss to the fact that women were not allowed to vote. He felt that most of the males who were eligible to vote did so only in exchange for material things such as alcohol or cash, which his opponents were able to supply. The experience of her husband impressed upon Mary the need for women to be able to vote. She had been agitating that powers that be for some time to give women equal rights of voting with men, but she had been unsuccessful until she joined forces with some other strong-willed and intelligent women. Mabel Cordelia Holloway Walker was a capable and dynamic advocate for the change in the Bahamas. The fact that she was an American born in Greensville, South Carolina on May 2, 1902, in no way diminished her passion for education and gender equality in the Bahamas. She studied at Howard University in Washington, D.C., where she obtained her Bachelor's of Arts degree and met her Bahamian husband, Claudius Rowland Walker, who was then studying for the Bachelor's of Science degree. Mrs. Walker relocated to the Bahamas with her husband after he completed his medical studies at Mary Harry College in Nashville, Tennessee. Mabel Walker was also a catalyst for the women's suffrage movement. She brought together strong-willed and intelligent women of diverse social and political background when she suggested to Georgina Simonet, later chairman of the women's branch of the PLP, that seek the assistance of Mary Ingram, wife of former UBP leading member of the House of Assembly. Mrs. Walker labored in the suffrage movement from 1950 until 1962. It is indeed a testimony to her character that she fought for a cause from which she could derive no direct benefit, as she was an American. She knew that the cause was just and that the fight was for her children and many Bahamian youth. Eugenia Louise Lockhart was a secretary of the women's suffrage movement and secretary of the women's branch of the Progressive Liberal Party. She was an active in fundraising and organizing for both groups. Mrs. Lockhart and Doris Johnson were the two suffragettes who accompanied H.M. Taylor to London in 1960. By 1967, black women had organized themselves into voting bloc. It was this bloc which significantly impacted the Progressive Liberal Party's victory that ushered in majority rule. Mrs. Lockhart's husband, Captain Edward Lockhart, and their children share her efforts for a woman's right. Mrs. Lockhart was appointed to the Order of British Empire and was made stewardship counselor of the PLP.
Georgiana Kathleen Simonet was born April 4, 1902 in Wemyss Bight, Eleuthera, to Olivia McKinney and Alexander Simonet. She was educated at the government school in Wemyss Bight and later became a monitor there, assistant teacher. Georgiana Simonet's ambition to improve herself professionally caused her to migrate to Nassau to pursue nursing at the Bahamas General Hospital, renamed the Princess Margaret Hospital. Ms. Simonet had a passion for politics, the rights of women, and the advancement of black people socially, economically, and politically. It was this dimension of her life which has set her apart. Her political contribution has continued through 2 generations of her children. Her son, Sir Clement Maynard, was a minister of the government for 25 consecutive years and Deputy Prime Minister of the Bahamas from 1985 to 1992, and 2 of her grandchildren have served as ministers of government. Teacher, suffragette, politician, and author Dr. Doris Johnson, born Doris Sands in 1921, had been long a social and political fighter for the rights of women. When she returned to the Bahamas in 1958 from studying abroad, the women's suffrage movement embraced her passion and oratorical skills. She was able to mobilize the movement into a fighting force while coordinating the founding of the National Council of Women. In 1959, Dr. Johnson led a demonstration to Parliament and gave a pivotal speech in the Magistrates' Court to members of the House of Assembly on the moral right of women to vote. This event was a turning point in the road to achieving suffrage. The PLP and independents deposed the deferral of the right, and an appeal was made to London again. In February 23, 1961, the House of Assembly, perhaps pressured by London, enacted the law to give women the right to vote and sit in the legislature with effect from June 30, 1962. When the 1962 general election was held, Doris Johnson became the first woman ever to contest the seat. She ran for the Eleuthera district. She did not win, but she had run the first leg of a race that would be completed by Mrs. Janet Bostwick 20 years later. In 1967, the PLP became the government of the Bahamas, and Dr. Johnson became the first woman appointed to the Senate, the first woman leader of the government business in the Senate, the first woman minister of government from 1968 to 1973 in the Ministry of Transport, and the first woman president of the Senate, 1973 to 1979 at age 52. Dame Alberta became a founding member of the women's branch of the Progressive Liberal Party, the first political party of record in the Bahamas. By 1961, Dame Alberta and the women of the Bahama Islands marked their X for the first time in the 1962 general election. Today, the women of the Bahamas are beneficiaries of the gallant efforts of Dame Alberta Isaacs and the women's suffrage movement. Dame Alberta had contributed tremendously without fear or doubt to the cause. Her courage and sacrifice were acknowledged when she became the first female in the Bahamas to be bestowed the honor of Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1974. Throughout her life, Dame Bertha, as she was affectionately called, served the nation in various capacities in civic and social organizations, such as the Girls Industrial School, the Persis Rogers Home for the Aged, of which she was the first president, the Elks Family, the Good Samaritans Lodge, Excelsior Purple Cross Nurses Unit, the Red Cross, the YWCA, the Eastern Union Burial Society, and St. George's Church Choir. And finally, Althea Mortimer was born on 28 November 1908 in Matthewtown, Inagua, the second child of Samuel and Leila Mortimer. Her family moved to Nassau after her father died in a tragic accident rescuing her brother from drowning. In Nassau, Miss Mortimer entered the government school system. By age 12, she had completed all of the available education, but she stayed on as a monitor for several years later. Miss Mortimer passionately believed in and supported the rights of women to vote. She helped to draft and type several of the documents created by the women's suffrage movement to further their cause in the halls of Parliament. She was also the guest speaker at Education for Citizenship, which was a seminar designated by the leaders of the women's suffrage movement to prepare Bahamian women to assume their political responsibilities. In 1965, 3 years after the gain of universal adult suffrage and women's suffrage in the Bahamas was still under rule of the Bay Street Boys. Pinling and his cohorts, such as Sir Milo Butler, His Excellency Sir Arthur Folkes, His Excellency Sir Orville Turnquest, the Honorable Paul Adderley, and a few others in their organization, were fed up with not yet being equal or having any rights in their country. Their rallies to gain some kind of headway in the Bahamas were first manifested violently and overtly in the infamous Black Tuesday. On the night before Black Tuesday, April 26th, Pinling and his delegates planned exactly what was to happen in the House of Assembly the following day. Pinling would present his speech as usual, and if he is not given the respect he deserved, he would throw the Speaker's mace out the window, which is the utmost sign of authority and assembly in the House of Assembly. The following day, April 27, 1965, the plan went exactly as said, only with Sir Milo adding fuel to the fire by throwing the Speaker's hourglass out of the window as well. This all transpired in front of a roaring crowd which was gathered outside on the grounds, who were all in full support of the actions. However, even though 2 years after this majority rule went into effect, January 10, 1967, many of the members during Black Tuesday departed and formed their own group known as the Dissident Eight.
After the 1962 election, when we expected the PLP would win and we lost, it was the first time we had universal adult suffrage, and I was working with the Tribune at the time. I was news editor at the Tribune, and we decided that we had to reach our people. We had a newspaper, The Herald, which was edited by Cyril Stevenson, which is a lambaste oligarchy every week. But we thought that we needed something different. We needed to address the shackles, as Sir Lyndon Data put it, on the minds of our people. And so we decided to start a newspaper. And after the election, which was November 26, 1962, I left the Tribune and we started Bahamian Times. And Bahamian Times became a very popular newspaper. It was a political journal published every week on Wolf Road. And people came from all over because we took a different approach. We tried to explain to, there's this prejudice that black people could not govern. And that was the propaganda in 1962. You vote for these fellas, they can't govern. We're the ones who control the money, blah, all the rest of that. So, and a lot of our people still believed in the, not all, but enough, still believed in inferiority. Brainwashing to believe in the inferior. So we had to tackle those things. So we sort of elevated the dialogue, the political dialogue through Bahamian Times. We pointed out what they were doing wrong constantly, we attacked them, but we also we printed positive things. For instance, a lot of our people didn't know about the history of Africa and the achievements of black people. Some of them still don't know. So we did that. Eugene Nuri, for instance, who went off right after the '62 election, he used to write a regular feature on African culture and history. And this was designed to open the eyes of our people and take the shackles off their minds. And we talked about all the issues. We talked about black history, what happened in America, what happened in Africa. We told them about the great kingdoms that existed in Africa before the Europeans were civilized. Some people were shocked that they didn't know that. So Bahamian Times played a major role in taking the progressive message to the people. And I was privileged to have been the editor of that newspaper, which meant that I wrote most of it. But we had some great people who came in and helped, just volunteered. It was quite amazing. I can think of some people who, just came by on weekends and evenings to help get the paper out. It's quite amazing. I remember Roosevelt Cadet, for instance, George Smith, who later became MP. Any number of people just came by to help because they realized it was so important. And I believe that helped considerably in changing people's minds and turning the tide in 1967. So that was a role I played. I also played a role in the internal politics of the party because I was one of a group of young men who were regarded as young radicals at the time. And we sort of took over the party from the founders because we were not about compromises, we were not about doing deals, we were not about participating in the system, we were about changing the system and changing the government. And we thought this thing about cooperating and getting some concessions here and some concessions there, that was not the game we wanted to play. And so we supported the leadership of Sir Lyndon Pindling, our group called the NCPA. And we made the PLP an agent of deliverance for the black Bahamians and the establishment of a non-racial parliamentary democracy. We are blacks and whites. We're not against white people. We've got a lot of good white people. And even those who are not good, they're still Bahamian. So that was our vision. And I was very pleased when in 1967 I was one of those who was elected that day.
In December 1972, the government headed by Prime Minister the Right Honorable Lyndon Pindling and the opposition headed by Sir Kendall Isaacs led a delegation to London to discuss the Independence Constitution. The surviving framers of the Constitution of the Bahamas are Sir Arthur Folkes, the Honorable Arthur D. Hanna, Sir Orville Turnquest, the Honorable A. Loftus Roker, George A. Smith, and the Honorable Philip M. Bethel. Deceased signatories include Sir Lyndon Pindling, Sir Milo Butler, the Honorable Paul L. Adderley, Sir Clement Maynard, the Honorable Carlton E. Francis, Sir Kendall Isaacs, the Honorable Cardwell C. Armbruster, the Honorable Henry J. Bowen, and the Honorable Norman S. Solomon. Lyndon Pindling realized that the country needed something that would raise its sights beyond mundane and temporary tribulation and provide a surge of national pride and purpose. This would be Bahamian independence. At the opening of the Independence Conference for the Bahamas at Marlborough House in London on Tuesday, December 12, 1972, Prime Minister Pinling declared that our islands have graduated from all the schools of constitution, being economic and social philosophies. There were many who were against the new talks about independence, such as the official opposition. Arrington Watkins, a member of the Free National Movement and MP for Marsh Harbour Abaco at that time, told a British newsman that he had come to campaign against independence. He also claimed to be the official spokesman for the 8,000 people of Abaco. In the Bahamas in 1972, there were talks of a threat by Abaco to secede from the Bahamas should it attain independence. A petition to secede by Abaco loyalists was also submitted to the British government in the late 1971, but it was then neglected. At the conference, there was primary interest in attaining independence, ironing out the question about who would have a right to claim citizenship. The opposition and the government got together, and it was the Bahamas delegation against the British government who had their ideas about Bahamian citizenship. The Bahamian delegation was satisfied with the outcome, and it emerged with a constitution. The delegation reached a final agreement with the British, and the signing of the Constitution took place in December of 1972. On December 20th, 1972, the British government agreed to recommend to its Parliament in the form of a white paper that the Bahamas should become an independent nation on July 10th, 1973. On April 2nd, 1973, the Minister of Home Affairs, the Honorable R.F. Anthony Roberts, announced in the House of Assembly that the Bahamas had a new flag. March on Bahama Land is the national anthem of the Bahamas. It was composed by Timothy Gibson and adopted in 1973. The Police Band's album entitled March on Bahama Land contains the first recording ever of the Bahamas national anthem. This album was produced in 1973 at the Ace Recording Studios in Miami, Florida. The Pledge of Allegiance was written by Reverend Dr. Philip Ramming. There was national competition to produce the motto for the coat of arms, and the competition was won by two 11-year-old school children, Vivian F. Moultrie of Inagua Public School and Melvern B. Bowe of the Government High School in Nassau. Bahamian artist Hervis Bain prepared the preliminary design of the coat of arms. God Bless Our Sunny Clime is the national song of the Bahamas. It was written by Reverend Dr. Philip Ramming and composed by the late Timothy Gibson and the late Clement Bethel. On May 22, 1973, the Bahamas Independence Bill passed in the House of Commons. On July 10, 1972, independence was fully achieved. The Bahamas Independence Secretariat was responsible for the independence celebrations of 1973. The chairman was the Honorable George Smith, who was the parliamentary secretary in the office of the Prime Minister. He was assisted by Harold A. Munnings, who was the coordinator. The independence celebrations also had an advisory council. The Right Honorable Lyndon Pinling was the chairman. Many talented Bahamians were given the chance to head committees for the independence celebrations. These included Clement Bethel for folklore and music, Hervis Bain, Patrick Ramming, and James Rowe for arts and crafts, Bishop Michael London for poetry, essay, and drama, Horace Wright for the float parade, and Gus Cooper for track and field. The government of the Bahamas spent some $2 million on independence celebrations. While headlines in local newspapers were dominated by the Watergate scandal involving the then U.S. President Richard Nixon, the Secretary George Smith was busy planning the independence celebrations. South Andros was the first island visited by the Right Honorable Lyndon Pinling on his island-hopping independence tour. There was an independence basketball tournament June 29th through July 5th held at C.I. Gibson Gym. From July 8th to the 14th, a national arts and crafts exhibition was held at Jumbay Village. James Rowe served as the chairman, and Hervis Bain was the co-chairman of this event. Following this Jumbay 73, a national festival of arts was also held at the village. The theme of the Independence Regatta was either scenes from Bahamian history or a scene depicting the spirit of independence. Horace Wright served as the chairman of this event. The Independence Regatta was held July 5th through 7th in New Providence. Dignitaries from 52 countries attended a formal reception at Government House on July 8, 1973. The dinner was hosted by Prince Charles. The United States President's special representatives at the independence celebrations were Mr. and Mrs. Stanley Scott. Prince Charles laid the cornerstone of the central bank on July 9, 1973. On the evening of July 9, 1973, a musical and cultural display entitled Pages from Bahamian History was held at Clifford Park. It portrayed Bahamian heritage through dance and music. The show was coordinated and directed by Winston Saunders, and Clement Bethel was its artistic and musical director. At 11:45, there were prayers that lasted 15 minutes, 5 minutes to midnight. July 9, 1973, Irvin Taylor was prepared to raise the Bahamas flag for the first time before a crowd of around 60,000 people. Irvin Taylor and Alfred Williams stood before then Prime Minister Lyndon Pinling and His Royal Highness Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, along with thousands of Bahamians. At midnight, the Bahamas' flag took its place for the first time atop a 42-foot flagpole as the Bahamas national anthem started to play. In months leading up to independence, the national anthem was playing on radio stations at midnight so Bahamians could learn it. Alfred Williams was responsible for lowering the Union Jack. Everyone came out onto the field afterwards to celebrate and dance when the flag reached the top. The crowd erupted with life and tears were flowing. As the Queen's representative, Prince Charles read a personal message from Her Majesty on Independence Day, July 10, 1973.